Hello and welcome to Identity Office Hours. I'm your host, Mike Schwartz, founder of Glue. Today is episode 143. Quick reminder, follow us on LinkedIn. Comments and reposts also help us to get the word out. Our guest today is Justin McCarthy, co-founder and CTO of StrongDM. Welcome, Justin.
Hey, Mike. Thanks, and thanks for the invite and the discussion.
So before we dive into the topic of today, maybe you could just quickly introduce yourself and tell us how you got here.
Yeah, of course. All right. So, the quick story is I've definitely always been a startup person. I'm here in Silicon Valley, originally from the East Coast of the U.S. But just really one startup after another, always building products, always building something for consumers or enterprises. And actually, prior to StrongDM, immediately prior, I had a few experiences that really led me to want something better in terms of how access tends to be granted, specifically to sensitive systems. So I was always that person that was in charge of saying no to people or saying yes to people. And there was just no right answer. Okay, you would say yes, and you would sort of book some more risk on the ledger. You would say no, and somebody would be frustrated. They couldn't do their job, right? When it came time to create the first implementation of StrongDM, that was really the image. It was how can we have some finesse in saying yes and no, and then in terms of receiving that access, how can you make it feel great?
So the topic today is unlocking continuous zero trust authorization with Cedar. And but before we get into Cedar itself, maybe you can tell me a little bit about how you think StrongDM is changing traditional PAM.
Sure. Not everyone is familiar with the history of the PAM segment. So just a quick recap. At some point after we had enterprises with a whole bunch of systems, someone realized that there are certain accounts that have different levels of power. You could think of it as a bigger blast radius if something bad happened to that
A
account.
root
So
password,
as
for example.
Yes, the root password, for example, or more prominently in many cases, the Windows administrator password for the domain controller, et cetera. So once we had a few oopses, in the 80s and 90s around that, a formalization of essentially like better hygiene became necessary and obvious. Then there were a number of companies that were positioned to do that early on. Okay, and a lot of those companies really grew up around the notion of protecting that password. That was because that essentially that was the key to the kingdom. That was the only kind of key that was available. So it made sense to orient your architecture around password protection. Now, with the cloud era, there are a lot of other manifestations of authorization and authentication that can give you powers, right? A lot of those schemes that are present and familiar from the cloud, those are certificate-based schemes, even SSH certificate-based schemes. Those really didn't exist at the beginning of time, nor did the cloud. So if you just essentially reconceive of how would I want it to work in the modern era, you close your eyes, you come up with that conception. Essentially, that should be the definition of PAM today. Okay, and you're going to find those attributes if you go to our website, of course.
It's a kind of very it's an answer of where our product is whatever you aspire to, but we'll dig more into
Well,
that. It's
yeah,
an
sure,
interesting
sure.
definition, but I like the orientation around risk management. I agree with that 100%. Um, but we'll push you on that in a second. Let
Sure.
me ask. Let's pivot into the second part of the title, which was Cedar. When did StrongDM identify Cedar, and what properties of Cedar policy syntax did you think were the most important to commercialize?
Sure. We actually, thankfully, I would just say got lucky that we happened to essentially go shopping for a major upgrade to our approach to authorization shortly after the paper was published and Cedar itself was available, really that the team sort of unveiled it. So it was really sort of just after that we happened to have a shootout with a bunch of languages and a bunch of approaches. So, and I apologize if I get the date wrong, but it's over 2 years ago at this point. Is sort of when we put our finger and we said that looks right. I will say, actually, I'm gonna maybe give a different answer than some would give on this subject. So the principle why is the way I like to say it is that it gives you a way of thinking about the problem. Okay, so the syntax itself, even though mostly the syntax is used by the machine, right? So most of your day is spent not looking at the syntax and relying on the performance properties and relying on the correctness properties. But when you're performing a design as a human, you're looking at it. Its legibility is just really gets you thinking in the right direction, and it leads you to design the rest of your application architecture in a way that's going to ultimately work out well at a PDP and PEP scope. Okay, so that's really the thing that caught my eye is it gives you a frame and a lens.
Hmm. Okay. Um, and I'll push on. One of the things that I've been thinking about is how traditionally we have a very identity centric view of the world. Like a person joins and we provision them into systems. I don't know that much about StrongDM. Would you say you have an identity centric approach, or do you go from the other direction and, um, let's say, look backwards from the resource, or tradition where, work where traditionally we work from access to resource? Are you looking at it the other way from the resource first?
Okay, so great question, and depending on how your product grew up, I suppose you're going to have a slight bias in one direction or the other. At this point, we've been working on this problem for long enough that I don't see or feel a lot of distinction between how you organize your principles, how you organize your resources, and how you organize your actions using Cedar terminology there. It's an organization problem and a hygiene problem in every dimension, in every direction. Okay,
Hmm.
so obviously, when it comes to the identity side, in order to have an understanding of those identities, then yeah, you need to be quite confident with the identity primitives that are present out there, right? So you need to understand how IDPs want to deal with, think about, and what attributes they would tend to have available to in inventory to describe those identities. And then correspondingly on the resource side, you need to grapple with this very messy reality that it's not just resources. It's not sufficient to go through Azure's data model and define the universe as they would, because not only do you have multiple clouds, but you also have many vintages of real systems that are out there. There are still mainframes. There are still many physical data centers with physical machines with bare metal, and certainly that bare metal is often connected by bare metal switches, and so you're going to have to log into those things as well. So you need an object model and a data model for the resource surface that's as detailed and as essentially the world.
Hmm. Um, okay. Um, So let me actually ask a different question, which is related. Um, would you say that enterprises should start from the cloud and sort of move back, and say, okay, everything we can do on the, in terms of all the applications we can control access to on the cloud, let's start there. And we'll be left over with some legacy stuff. You mentioned mainframe. I think I might have some code that's still running on mainframes.
Yep.
um, so do you start with the cloud and then do whatever is left? Maybe that whatever's left is your CyberArk implementation. But what are your thoughts about on sort of the strategy, how companies should go about this today?
So my advice there is always going to be pragmatic, which is, Mike, you should start wherever you can get the project funded. Okay, and sometimes you're going to have an acute problem related to something in an older vintage of technology, right? So that older vintage that you have to lift and shift because that data center is going out of business, or they're redirecting the river through, and they need to physically turn off those machines or something. So if you have a forcing function, you put your finger on and say, "Gosh, you know what? This is the opportunity to." To bite off a little bit of the problem, then that's what you should start with. And I would also encourage folks, to remember that it's sort of all just technology. Even though AWS has a beautiful set of documentation about how to think of logging into things. Your older vintage technology, how to get into those VMs that are organized differently. There's still answers to how to get into those, and you still can model them as something which you have to make an intentional decision about, rather than just having let's say an inherited habit of protecting the password for that VMware instance, right? You can do better even for older technology. So really start anywhere, start with an acute business problem, but solve it in a way that gets you a little bit closer to that sort of IAM and authorization nirvana.
Yeah. So let me put the title up again. So unlocking continuous zero trust authorization with Cedar. So this has been sort of a topic. We've done a couple episodes on this here. Sean Dell from who leads the Shared Signals group or he's one of the co-leads, I should say, with a tool, and also Shane from Cisco, I think. Um, so there's been sort of this move towards continuous authentication, the idea that not adaptive authentication, but actually continuous authentication. And I think this is really this is authorization essentially. So what are your thoughts on, I'd love to hear specifically about the new shared signals standard, which just went final. And I know Ian Glazer from Signal has advocated that you should start building your infrastructure around this new thing called an event hub.
Mhm.
And what are your thoughts on sort of like how is the architecture changing as we're moving towards continuous authentication or authorization?
Sure. All right. So for this one, I've got sort of like a whole bunch of opinions. So you're gonna
Okay.
have to stop me. Okay. So interrupt, and then
I'll put
we're
a
gonna have to
test
like
pause for
meet.
a second at some point.
We're gonna have
Yeah.
to, yeah, we're gonna have to meter this out. Okay. So the first observation that I'd offer is that gosh, computers are fast. Okay. And sometimes, if you're focused on, just building an IDP where you're never stressed on throughput, you don't actually can you can fail to realize how fast modern physical hardware can be. Okay,
Hmm.
but same goes for networks. Same goes for reliability. How much reliability you can get out of these systems. So what I would observe is that the amount of information that we need to communicate someone's identity, right, to attach and transport a policy, right, about who Mike
Hmm.
is and what Mike is allowed to do in this moment. The amount of information relative to the payload, whatever Mike's actually trying to do, right, like upload a live stream, right, the amount of information is so tiny. Okay. So really, this is a question of formatting and conventions more than it is reliability or throughput. And therefore, you can actually turn up your ambition, I would say way up, right? The amount of work that your computer is doing right now with your EDR, right, to inspect every byte that's being written by your web browser right now to the file
Yeah.
system as a log, right? That amount of work is far more than we typically allocate to the TLS handshake, right? And so what I would just say is this notion of having far more data, having a more capable data model, and then expecting that data model to essentially be present continuously. And so that is an event-driven orientation. That is certainly at a connection scope, at an individual connection scope, that's having a lot of additional sort of guarantees about who that connection is coming from. That's just something that we could begin to expect from the whole ecosystem. Okay, so I just fully endorse any bias toward basically just sharing a lot more information and really aspiring to real time. Okay, there's just too many great options for durable and non-durable event broadcast systems. There's too many great architectures out there. We got to start using them in identity.
Yeah. So, um, okay, well, let's talk about some of those contextual dynamic signals.
Sure.
So we have a lot of signals from devices, from browsers, um, user behavior, um, and which of these do you think are the most valuable as input to policy, or what's the low hanging fruit with some of these dynamic contextual data streams?
So, so here I am going to share a little bit of a bias from my lens. Okay,
Sure.
so I think the most valuable is actually the most missing component that I tend to encounter in real systems out there, and that is what we refer to internally at StrongDM as the extraction of nouns and verbs from a given data flow. Okay, so you've got a connection with a Kubernetes cluster. Okay, if you were to just ask like what's happening, like if you imagine with Wireshark or something like that, well, what's happening is kind of a lot of API calls. That's what it looks like to interact with the Kubernetes cluster. But if you were to ask at a different scope, like what are the semantics of that? That might be a debit from a bank account. That might be transferred from funds from user A to user B, right? So up at that semantic layer, translating that what's happening in the bytes and packets up to semantic actions that are happening,
Mhm.
to me that's the biggest gap, pervasively, right, in every direction, right. An interaction with a Postgres database is not about how many bytes are being transferred. It's about how Mike's user profile is changing versus Justin's user profile, right. And so that aspect of signal is profoundly missing because, and this is we're going to keep coming back to this theme, because data modeling every application everywhere in every direction is it feels like an intractable problem, and so we almost tend to not even try to see it.
Mhm.
And that's one thing that we essentially have realized, that if you can perform that deep inspection to extract those nouns and verbs, then it's very easy to say things like, if Mike doesn't have a current MFA and a current device posture, well then when by the time he goes to press the button that confirms the bank account transfer, we actually want that particular gesture. He can look at the bank account, but when he presses the button to do it, we need another person to validate that, yeah, Mike's video call still looks like him, and he remembers what we did last week, so
You need more
he's not an
evidence.
AI. A little bit more evidence, right? And so being able to express that thought is mostly inexpressible today, because the details inside of SAP that govern that particular transaction, they're just not visible to Active Directory, right? And
Yeah.
so connecting those concepts together at that depth is a thought that most folks can't think, and that's the thought that I want many more people to think.
Hmm. Um, it sounds like, and you think Cedar is a good match because of the ability to define the schema for a lot more sort of nouns out there. Gives you the ability to more correctly like model how the world really looks. We could say.
It's exactly that. So I had a friend that just yesterday launched a product for sort of managing your local tool lending library, right? So
Hmm.
and I actually have a case where I need a wheelbarrow right now because mine broke.
Uh-huh.
Okay, this is a real story from yesterday. So I have some stuff I need to cart into the backyard, and right now I have no wheelbarrow. So rather than adding one to my inventory, I'm going to knock on my neighbor's door and I'm going to borrow their wheelbarrow.
Yeah.
So the feedback I gave my friend who just launched this tool lending library is, I actually want to snap a picture of the wheelbarrow. I want to label it as belonging to Mike
Yeah.
in the system.
Metadata.
Just so I can give you a receipt that says, you know what, this is
Hmm.
yours, but I'm borrowing it. So I could actually come up with a data model for saying that application, which is a nascent, like, side project application, could have a way of saying, expressing ownership, and Cedar could be exactly the language to do it, right? It didn't anticipate the existence of wheelbarrows. It didn't anticipate the existence of peer-to-peer lending in the tool library case, but Cedar has all of the data modeling you need to express that idea, as well as who should be able to approve the bank account transfer.
Jeff Lombardo from Amazon AWS. I don't know if you know him. He's prominent in
Yes.
the standards group, and he always hassles me because I sort of have an LDAP orientation of the world,
Hmm.
because I came out of directory services.
Sure.
Um, but in LDAP, of course, we always had to define the schema for object classes and attributes, and people they were annoyed by this, and everyone loves the idea of no schemaless like JSON databases, which I love too, but um, having a defined schema actually does give you some advantages, especially when you're trying to get agreement. Um, and but I feel like the Amazon team almost doesn't want to market, or maybe I should say the Cedar team is afraid to market Cedar schema, because schema in general in the tech industry is seen as a bad thing. I'm just wondering, what are your thoughts on schema, and especially Cedar's position on schema as a requirement only for analyzability?
Right. So I very much appreciate the decision, the balance that the Cedar team has taken, and I believe it's actually the correct balance, and I'll explain why. So I, like you, Mike, am definitely a schema partisan, right? And I actually think a lot of these things, these preferences, go in cycles. Okay, so the rigor of talking, expressing your thoughts in a relational database, that's what gave birth to Mongo's. Ease of adoption, right? Because someone had the correct observation that you just want to make a web page, you want to get started easy, right? And like, kudos to the Mongo designers. They said, it just, what, don't think up front, right? And then, but as an industry, we all recognized what happened when we didn't think hard up front about the concepts we were trying to represent, right? And so that led to, I would say, a reappreciation of having schema, in just general application development, right? So I think that the downsides of just getting started with Mongo are now quite visible, and folks appreciate why you might like to actually think through, how this thing is going to be organized ultimately. I think absolutely the same thing applies. The exciting thing about Cedar is that you just have a progressive application of basically when you consider that schema in your development lifecycle. So you can start, with less schema, you can start with less enforcement, and then you increment into it over time. I love that posture, and I think for within application groups that are part of an ecosystem together, across different boundaries, I think it provides a default language for not having to renegotiate date and time and integer types over and over again.
First name and
Um,
last name.
yeah,
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 cool. So the vibe coding, or this is really cool. Like we want people to generate code, and I sort of go to the next level where I say people are going to, or developers in particular, are going to generate Cedar policies, and we want that, because it's very productive. Yeah, generate my policies and I'll review them. That's very productive. But I think one of the you can't use generative AI to generate your policies and use generative AI to check your policies. um, and so I think what Cedar offers is sort of a balance where we can say, okay, the who knows what hallucinations are in this policy that might got generated, but we're going
mhm,
to load them and validate them, up front, and have some confidence that these things are actually all right, some real confidence.
yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could talk about the tooling, like the promise of the tooling and the reality of the tooling. Like, how do you feel? It was the promise, like really of analyzability or universal statements. Was that really important to your decision? And where do you think we are in that journey? Because it's like zero knowledge proofs. It's easy to say, but hard to do. Where do you think we are in terms of tooling in that journey?
I think that the analyzability constraints on the language are just really important hints that prevent you from getting into situations further down the line that you're going to regret. So I think those guardrails are, they're little smells and indicators that you need if you want something that rubs up against an analyzability constraint. It gives you a chance to reconsider and solve the problem a different way. I find that there's nothing that I really want to say about any noun or verb that's expressible in software that I can't say fluently in Cedar. So after a little bit of familiarity with the language, any thought you want to have, I certainly am better able to express it in Cedar than any other regime. So I would say the tooling generally, the core evaluation, I think that's the thing that I rely on most. And to your point on generative AI tools, those code generators, they love to have objective grounding, right? It's not like they're trying to avoid the objective grounding. So they love to have a tool that says, is it right? And it just runs and it tells them if it's right or not. So I think it's very harmonious with sort of some aspects of where software development is probably trending.
I wish Claude actually ran those tools because it makes up Cedar. It's like I'm like that's
Yes,
not even a Cedar like construct. So I don't know about catching it.
you're absolutely right. Yeah.
But it's still productive, even if I do catch it making some stuff. Um, and um, okay, well, let me see. I kind of lost my thought here, but um, maybe we can go back to okay. This is sort of a random question because I'm not that familiar with PAM. How does
Mhm.
StrongDM differ from Teleport?
Oh, sure. Well, part of building a product is mostly staring at customers and not staring at other implementations.
Yeah.
So I'll say like I'm not a teleport expert at all. But I'm always a fan of open source software and projects that help sort of increase the awareness that you can have a better way of accessing your infrastructure. So just a couple of hunches, if I had to guess, that you might see differently when you use our product. So I alluded to this earlier, but really we sort of look in every direction with sort of equal priority in terms of the resource types that you need to access, right? So some might make a case that accessing a database versus accessing a Windows server versus accessing a Kubernetes cluster, that those
Mhm.
have different relative weight and priorities in terms of their blast radius and sensitivity. But I'll just say, unless you're wrapping your arms around the whole problem, then
Mhm.
I think the nature of cybersecurity is that you always have a weakest link, right? And so we really want to sort of purge out all of those weakest links. And a lot of times the barriers to getting that last 5% of resources inducted into a hygienic system, that barrier is because so and so system can't be modified. Right, it's that team's gone, they've retired.
Yeah.
Right, it's a pretty common story. So the nature of our inline proxy, being able to understand those nouns and verbs and being able to control access to that system without any application changes, that's just a huge differentiator that is really meaningful to complex enterprises that have a messy middle, right? They understand eventually, at the end of the modernization journey,
Yeah.
as if there was an end. But they understand what it should look like, but they're sort of weighed down by the reality of their current vintage systems. So we just have answers, and not theoretical answers. We have practical customer answers to say, do it like this, and you're going to be able to have fairly equal hygiene across your most modern cloud access use cases and your most legacy, network gear use cases.
So more of a one-stop shop for authorization across whatever resources we can help you get your hands around.
Yeah, and I'll say, that's what any company would want to be, right?
Yeah.
But we've just been doing it for long enough that it's a specialization of ours to be able to
Yeah.
say yes to all that mess.
I
So
actually
that
think
that even rhymed. Yeah.
just throwing my 2 cents in about Teleport. We've used their product, but I'm not an expert in this area either. I think they're going the opposite direction, where they're specializing on SSH sessions and RDP and session playback and some more features around that. So I think there is another way to go, like super segmented. I think they're going super segmented on certain these two applications, which I see happen a lot with PAM systems. Because when I think of PAM, my worst case scenario is every application's a one-off. Like that's your worst possible set. And so what I see a lot of PAM solutions say is, okay, well, we'll be a one-off for Windows stuff, and we'll be a one-off for cloud stuff, and we'll be a one-off for database stuff, or we'll be a one-off for login stuff. And it's better because now you don't have 100 one-offs. you have 10 one-offs, but you still don't have centralization and consolidation.
So yeah, and I sorry, you're getting me. You're putting me on a soapbox. So my attention spans are not increasing. Like we need some vendor consolidation. Like your ability to hire a huge team in identity and access management, it just isn't there. Like
Yeah,
you need to bet on a few vendors, and so it actually is a necessity that these systems have a broad scope.
yeah. I want to pivot back to Cedar a little bit. One interesting thing that I've been thinking about is that so ITDR has been up and coming. I had Veracent on, and they have a great platform with some beautiful visualizations. Like it's not even it's like on the boundary of art and like commercial
Mhm.
product. They're really
Yep.
beautiful. But I was thinking the event stream from authentication, as you mentioned, you set up the TLS connection, and it
Mhm.
happens pretty quickly,
Yep.
and then it doesn't happen again. But the fire hose of data that we can get from authorization is
Mhm.
on a whole nother scale.
Yes.
And so, but my question is like, we want to work backwards from the attack to detecting the attack. So just getting a fire hose of data is not good. How
Mhm.
do we actually take that data and figure out what's actionable, anomalous, or potentially a threat?
Yeah. So this is something that we've of course also thought a lot about, and that's our threat detection team works on exactly these problems. What I would say is, even though it feels like a big step up in data volume, it's again still it's a de minimis fraction compared to 1 millisecond of YouTube videos, right? So the amount of information, it's a hard problem until you accept that it's a hard problem and you look around at like the self-driving pipeline, right? And then you
Yeah,
realize exactly how many pixels are flowing in to drive a Waymo, right? So and somehow they're handling all of those on board, right? So I would just say we have the edge, right? We have every node out there. We have the ability to provision even GPUs in the places where you want them, and therefore you have the capability to run neural networks in places that are convenient. So I would just say this is a signal processing problem. This is a data movement problem, but it's a tractable problem, and there are techniques from other industries that apply directly.
yeah.
So I'm very comfortable with our hope of being able to put our finger on anomalous signals. It's something we're doing today.
What are some of the new types of attacks that you think we might be able to detect today that we're not detecting?
Sure. So, I mean, I think if you ask about new types of attacks, I think there's no way to avoid talking about the disruption wave that we're undergoing right now, which is depending on where you are, your depending on how you call it, it's maybe the biggest disruption. So what AI unlocks is it unlocks the possibility of a lot more normal behavior, right? And so what I would say is our ability to detect is obviously has to follow the ability to attack. And so what that means is I think of it in terms of how a lot of the labs talk about it, spending tokens. We need to be able to prioritize where we spend analysis tokens as we are doing the signal processing of Mike's activity, right? So Mike is performing actions, right? And actually, part of the noun and verb extraction that Cedar helps us do is it's not just bytes, right? It's specific application scoped behaviors that we can use to characterize Mike's behavior. That's happening at some rate. That rate is something that we can have a low cost test on, but then as it becomes interesting, as it scores high on some interesting index, we can subject it to more and more and more analysis. So by the time we knock on your door and we say, Mike, did you really want to do this? We've already labored extensively on everything that you just did, everything that you've tended to do historically, and we've identified, you know what, we just need you to MFA, right? So I would say this problem, because of the LLMs themselves, it becomes tractable to really separate the machine from human behavior, the inside the threat actor from normal actor behavior.
Yeah. I just attended an open search conference in San Jose, and was hearing some of the state of the art sort of like strategies around recommendations and how many vectors there are that they
Mhm.
look at and consolidate in order to make these recommendations. And it sounds like you're sort of saying we need to take a similar approach in threat detection and really look at this huge array of vectors. But it's a slightly different problem because we're not making recommendations. We're saying what something's happening that's contrary to what the recommendations might say.
Yes.
Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's absolutely the case. And again, I would just say, like, if you break outside of the historical techniques from the field, and you look at search, and you look at what it takes to, make a Google recommendation, how many of those are flowing through. Karpathy's quote of like software 2.0 versus software 3.0. So the 2.0 being straight machine learning models. So how much of SERP pages out there are just software 1.0, a deterministic algorithm? How many of them are provided by software 2.0, a machine learning model, versus software 3.0, where the LLM is somehow involved? As we move through those vintages of software, really all of those techniques absolutely apply to separating threats from normal behavior.
Yeah, I'll put the link to that talk in our show if the
Great.
audience isn't familiar with it. It's a good talk. I recommended it to my sons in undergrad in computer science or
Oh yeah.
studying computer science as a minor. Yeah, it's different. Well, so we talked about continuous, we talked about authorization, we talked about Cedar. The only thing we haven't talked about is zero trust. Um, I like, of course, people will say this is just a trend or it's just the latest like way we're looking at security. But actually, I like the zero trust model, and I think it's useful, and that it's something that can be implemented not just by government but also by enterprise. Um, and but what does it mean to you? Why do you think it's so important to position this sort of metaphor in the industry, and how do you think StrongDM helps you get there?
Sure. So here, let me. I'm going to be a little bit contrarian for a moment. So I'm going to say first that no
The
one, no one
marketing
has
guys made
ever.
you did do it. You have
Yeah,
nothing. You,
yeah, yeah. No one has ever finished a zero trust project. We don't have
yeah,
zero trust today. You can't go around and you can't ask Starbucks, like, show me your zero trust certificate, right? And before I order this coffee, there's no such thing. What it does is it gives you a maturity model to talk about, right? It's to talk about with your CFO, right?
hmm
And you could say, look, there are a lot of folks that endorse this framework. It's a way of thinking. We, in fact, are thinking and acting in this way regarding our Kubernetes cluster over in GCP. Look here. Look at all the ways that we are actually quite sure that it's not about the network IP address or anything like that. We're quite sure that this workload is authorized to perform that action. That's the good. That's good. Now, the rest of our enterprise over here is not good in that way. And here are the properties that we want to take from the good version. And here's the project plan to copy that into the not as good version. I think it just gives you a very practical way of having that conversation that is framed in a way that other departments that you need to collaborate with can understand. Okay. So I just don't think I don't think that we're ever going to have zero trust stickers that we're going to put on our boxes. Unfortunately, it's a great framework, but I do think it's a useful rhetorical tool to get your project sustained funding.
yeah. And we need more metaphors and we need more words. I feel like we
Mhm.
sometimes we go back to using the same words over and over again. And I wish we'd be like more like Shakespeare and just make up some new words.
Yes.
Because like, oh, we don't have a word for this. We'll make up a new word. Um, but which actually brings me back to I wanted to um, pivot just for a second to the trust model. Um, when we're talking within the enterprise, there's an implicit sort of trust, although zero trust says I'm not going to trust any of my fellow services. They could be hacked or compromised. But the trust, there are differences when we cross the trust boundaries across domains. And we're seeing that one of the challenges of today's computing environment is that we're consuming a lot of third party services and we're crossing domain boundaries. Um, so maybe you could just comment for a second on the challenges that brings, and also talk a little bit about tokens and how tokens can help you share trusted information across domains and how that would help you solve this authorization challenge?
So my experience of this, it's what year is it? 2025, and I still experience this, and I still sort of marvel that we haven't solved this problem. But I will say that a big part of the observation of this problem, the experience of this problem as an end user and as an administrator, just was part of the genesis of obviously our product at StrongDM. Um, uh, there are folks that to do their job, they legitimately need to access a database. They legitimately need to access a Kubernetes cluster. They legitimately need to access an S3 bucket. All of those tasks are legitimate tasks. But if you ask, like, what does Microsoft SQL Server have in common with an SSH connection, and what does have in common with an Aerospike KV store? If you ask a software engineer that, they'll say, "What are you talking about? Those are totally different species." Right? And yet, you still need to have a story that threads all of them together in terms of how they're authenticated and how they're authorized. Okay, so in terms of crossing those authentication domains and authorization domains, you do need an answer. And so our answer has been to be that mux that can translate or be that clutch between those systems, because then you can have one answer, no matter what the type of resource or system or application or action you're attempting to perform. But it does need a broker function. It needs a translation and mapping function, and you need the ability to control policy, in that broker itself, right? So I think there's no way around it. You need an exchange system of some type. You obviously need an exchange of tokens, but also you need an exchange of connections, right? And so blending those together, I think, is just a necessity, because it's very unlikely that the Microsoft SQL Server team is going to get together with the Kubernetes team and high five about how they're going to standardize MTLS.
Okay, well, 41 minutes is up. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. Any last thoughts or summaries? We covered a lot of topics, but any last thoughts before we break?
So just circling back to Cedar for a second, I really do want to encourage folks that haven't tried it, really to experience the sort of joy of modeling and thinking through your problem in Cedar. There's really, anytime you encounter an application architecture that requires fine-grained authorization, it's quite daunting to implement it and DIY. On the other hand, with Cedar, you don't need to make a big upfront SaaS decision on essentially whose other proprietary model you're going to adopt. So just thinking in Cedar is something that I can just absolutely endorse for everyone. And then for those out there that have sort of multiple vintages of software, you want to dial up your authorization hygiene, authorization story. You want to get closer to that zero trust certificate letter. Really, there's no better company than StrongDM to have a conversation. So you can always find me. My email is just justin@strongdm. You can reach out to me. You can reach out to anyone on our team. But if you've got that legacy system out there and you wish it had the same properties as the modern system, or you love that modern system and you want to adopt that lens and really push it really throughout the enterprise with uniformity, with consistency, with auditability throughout, that's exactly the kind of conversation we're excited to have. And that the underpinning of that capability is sort of anchored in all of the properties of Cedar that you've heard about today and other editions of this stream.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think you nailed it, Justin. I'm just going to quickly announce the next episode. I read a really interesting series on updating OWASP microservices security cheat sheet, and there's a bunch of other related articles. So I thought it'd be interesting to have the author of that on. It's a guy, his name is Dimitri Druce from InnoQ in Cologne, Germany. So that's the next episode on Thursday. With that, I'll say thank you so much, Justin. This has been really, really fun. Thank you, audience, and we'll see you next time.